Lesson 3, Managing Client Options. Client options are kept in the DSM opt file. With Linux and Unix, there's also a DSM sys file for system-wide options for your backup archive client. You can set up your dsm.opt file or client preferences using the backup archive GUI or by editing the dsm.opt or dsm.sys file. This is a text file that you would use, say, Notepad in Windows or VI in Unix to work with. We'll show you a close-up of it in a minute. You can also create server-generated option sets. This is where an administrator would create option sets for multiple clients. Windows has our one options file, dsm.opt, which you worked with in Unit 2. Without configuring your dsm.opt file, the client and the server cannot talk to each other. Additionally, with Unix and Linux, we have the DSM sys file. This is an example of a dsm.opt file. You'll notice the asterisks. Asterisks mean this is a comment, not an option. If you took the dsm.sample file when you installed and configured your backup archive client, you would notice that it had a lot of information in it, but it was all commented out. It all had the asterisks. You remove the asterisk to include that comment. You would set your communication method to TCP/IP by removing the asterisk or uncommenting the line. By default, the client and server communicate on port 1500. You will also need to have the TCP server address. In our case, we're using localhost, which is a loopback address because we're running the server and client on the same system. And then we would have the node name. These four options must be in your dsm.opt file. So if you create one from scratch, all you'd need to have in order for the client to access the server would be communication method, the port number that you're communicating on, your TCP server address, and the node name for your client. You can create or edit your options file using the backup archive GUI. You would go to your utilities and then click Setup Wizard. This is how you would set up the initial options file. If you need to change an existing options file, you can either edit the file directly or with the backup archive GUI, click Edit Client Preferences and then edit the existing client options file. When you're using the graphical options editor, you're going to append options to the end of your options file. This is important to know when we're talking about the include-exclude list. As I mentioned before, the minimum options you must have in your dsm.opt file: TCP server address, communication method, TCP port 1500 by default, and your node name. This allows communication from the server to the client. Using the wizard with your backup archive GUI, you'll notice we've got our client options file set up. We've already selected the task, we've named the node name, and on this screen we're defining the communication method or COM method. As you go through the wizard, you would then add communication options, build an include-exclude list. We have a whole lesson on include-exclude. Your file exclusions, domain, and then you would create your options file. The password access generate option is something you're going to want to have when you're using your web client. What it does is if a client receives a return code from the server saying that the password is expired, the client has the ability to generate a new random password. This is what the option would look like in your dsm.opt file. Additional options that we're going to be talking about periodically are shown here on this slide. Again, our communication methods, our node names, the type of backup and archive processing. We'll have your language, your formatting, your scheduling, etc. So we've talked about the client options file. This is the dsm.opt file. We mentioned client options set that are defined on the server by the administrator and used for multiple nodes. If you have both, the client option set could override the client option file with a force option. So by default, your DSM.opt options will have precedence over your option sets unless those options use the force. The domain option is going to specify items that you want to include in your incremental backup. So you can use an option to have all of your domains or specify some. So you can enter into the client options file your DSM.opt domain followed by the domains, or you can issue from the command line DSMC incremental, so you're doing an incremental backup of these domains. In the Backup Archive GUI, you'd use the Preference Editor to set up your backup preference and determine the domains for your backups. By default, backups will be incremental.